Good day. Before I start this video, just a quick housekeeping matter, just to remind you that if you're watching us on Rumble, where all three of our channels, the Duran, Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou, are available. If you're watching any of our videos on Rumble, if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that, that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can become an active member, which will enable you to publish your own content as part of our community and to participate in my live streams, which take place every Wednesday. I would also say that if you join our locals community, you're able to watch all our videos, including live streams that we've done, for example, with Tom Longo, where we discuss the financial and economic aspects of the Ukrainian crisis, and with the great Robert Barnes. And we will be doing another live stream with him on Friday, in the evening on Friday, at least in the evening here in England. Now, as for today's video, I'm afraid, again, it has to be about the situation connected to Ukraine. I say connected to Ukraine because there is, it seems to me, two aspects to this story now. One is the resolution of the crisis within Ukraine itself, and we are now taking steady steps in that direction. It's apparently confirmed that the Ukrainian force in eastern Ukraine is surrounded by the Russians, and it seems that the Russian and military, in combination with the militia of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, are now steadily closing in on the remaining holdouts of the Ukrainian army and volunteer forces in the coastal city of Mariupol. There's also reports that the city of Nikolaev, the very important city of Nikolaev, in western Ukraine, between Crimea and the great city of Odessa, that's now gradually becoming encircled. Nikolaev, I should say, was a center of the Soviet shipbuilding industry, and before that of the Tsarist Russian shipbuilding industry. It's an important garden city. It is also a city that was inaugurated by Catherine the Great, and is a place where this shipyard that was established was apparently ordered. Its construction was ordered by Catherine the Great. So, though it's a name on the map for most people in the West, in Russia, and of course in Ukraine as well, and it's always important to remember these things, cities like Nikolaev come with considerable historical traction and significance. Anyway, it seems that that is the primary military picture, but overall we can now see that diplomacy is starting to become increasingly important as the Russians pursue their objective of using the powerful military forces they have in Ukraine to force the Ukrainian government to the diplomatic table to get it, in effect, to agree to the Russian demands for a political reconstruction of Ukraine. And we have seen hints, increasing hints, from Ukrainian officials that they're preparing to abandon the objective of seeking NATO membership. They're still holding out on some of the territorial subdivisions of Ukraine, but it's clear that some kind of negotiation is now underway or will be underway, and it seems that the meeting between the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba is indeed going to happen in Turkey, as has been much talked about. All I will say about this is that if this had indeed happened before the war began, if Ukraine had been persuaded by its Western backers to sit down and negotiate on these sort of terms, if it had previously before the war, for example, agreed not to pursue NATO membership, the high probability, in fact, the certainty, is that the war would have been avoided. Now, there is going to be much discussion and controversy about who's responsible for the war, whether it was a war of Russia's choice, or, as the Russians insist, and by the way, as most Russians, according to opinion polls, believe, a war forced on Russia by necessity. But let me reiterate again a point I have made many times, that the reason the war ultimately happened was because of a failure of diplomacy, a failure to accept and confirm the reality that NATO membership would never be granted to Ukraine, and that the Russians do have an effective veto over Ukraine's NATO membership, and also a failure on the part of the Western powers, and of course Ukraine itself, to implement fully the Minsk agreement Ukraine signed in 2015, which is enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution, but which Ukraine never implemented, and which the Western powers never persuaded Ukraine to implement. So if we get into a position where Ukraine does all of these things, forswears NATO membership, and comes to some constitutional and territorial arrangement, which may not be so completely different from what was laid out in the Minsk agreement, well, bear in mind, all of that could have been achieved without war happening. And unless that point is understood and appreciated, then I'm afraid any commentary about this conflict in Ukraine, to my mind, is of little value, and is indeed all but worthless. Anyway, there we are, a situation where the Russians are steadily tightening their grip on Ukraine itself, their military grip, and where they're pushing Ukraine finally to negotiate along the lines that the Russians have always been insisting upon, and which I am sure eventually they will achieve. Perhaps much more important than the crisis in Ukraine itself, except obviously for Ukrainians, for whom this has been an appalling tragedy, perhaps much more important is what is now clearly becoming the great economic rupture. And I say that because it seems to me that yet another line was crossed with the announcement by President Biden yesterday that the United States would no longer buy oil or oil products from Russia. Now, before I proceed with this, I think it is important to say at this point that that decision by the United States has created a division for the first time since the start of hostilities between the United States and its Western allies. The Europeans categorically rejected this any idea of giving up on Russian oil imports. This is because Europe is far more dependent on Russian oil imports than the United States is. And by the way, it receives a much greater quantity of these oil imports than the United States does. I'm going to say something further, which is that the Europeans saying that they will not join the United States in an embargo on Russian oil is akin to the Europeans saying that they will positively continue to buy Russian oil. Now, the implication of this may take a while to filter through, and for a time at least, we're going to no doubt continue to see Western oil companies and Western shippers refuse to buy Russian oil. But given the fact that the Europeans are in effect saying that they will indeed, at least for the short to medium term, continue to buy Russian oil, I expect that at some point, someone somewhere is going to screw up the courage, and we're going to see Russian oil shipments starting to be bought by European companies, by European oil companies and oil traders, as Shell briefly attempted to do before it gave up doing it under the wave of criticism that it came up against. So I suspect that this block on Russian oil is going to end fairly soon. But there's another point here that perhaps needs to be made, because this decision by the United States to embargo imports of Russian oil has had a further shockwave around the world. It has demonstrated yet again something which has now become true of this entire crisis. This is that for the first time, perhaps without fully understanding it and without fully understanding the implications, the Western powers are taking sanctions steps which in effect sanction themselves. The United States forswearing imports of Russian oil which because of its nature, it's rather heavy oil, is not easily replaceable internationally. There's been some talk of resuming oil imports from Venezuela. I suspect that's going to prove extremely controversial in the United States itself. But anyway, that's the decision that's been made. The decision that's been made is not to import this Russian oil, and Venezuelan imports look difficult. And the idea of reopening the pipeline to Canada apparently also looks politically difficult. Taking steps like this is going to affect Western consumers. And already there's been a big surge in fuel prices in the United States. And these, of course, are as nothing compared to the surges in energy prices that we're seeing just in the United States, but also in Europe and around the world. And food prices also look like they're going to soar because of the critical importance of Russia and Ukraine as major food exporters. And of course, there is the further problem that the Russians especially are critically important in the export and the supply, the worldwide supply of various essential products. It's interesting, for example, that Boeing has decided not to source titanium from Russia for its aircraft building programs, whereas Airbus has insisted that it will continue to do so, having apparently no choice. So we're going to see, it seems to me, over time, a massive rearrangement in world trade, because I don't think this is going to be reversed. I think that these sanctions measures are going to stay and they're going to become permanent. And though I take no credence at all to this great European Union program of freeing Europe's dependency from Russian oil and gas within a year, or reducing it to minimal levels within a year, I think the reality is that within the next 1, 2, 3 years, we're going to see patterns of world trade completely rearrange themselves. We're going to see Russian oil overwhelmingly destined for China, and apparently Russian oil is in fact more suited to Chinese needs than it is, by the way, to European or even American needs. This is much to do with the kind of crude oil we're talking about, heavy crude and all this. I'm not an oil engineer or a geologist, so I'm not going to discuss what all that means. Suffice to say, apparently Russian oil fits in fairly well with the Chinese industrial needs, and it fits in less well with European and North American needs. So I think we're going to see Russian oil, Russian gas, Russian strategic metals, all those products start to head east towards China and to the ASEAN countries. And we're going to see the Russians import consumer goods, textiles, silk, all those handicrafts, all those sort of things increasingly from China and Southeast Asia and possibly India, rather than from Europe, as has been done until now. And the Western powers, for their part, will have to import more of their oil from the Gulf. And of course, they will have to turn to liquefied natural gas to fulfill their gas needs. Now, that will leave them with a permanently higher cost for their energy. But it seems to me that the die is cast. That is clearly what they're now going to do. It's going to reduce their competitiveness against Asian producers, but it's the decision that they've made. And I'm going to say something. There's going to be an enormous amount of economic turbulence over the next couple of years. The Kenyan energy minister has estimated it will take about 4 years for things to fully settle down. And maybe he's right. But I'm going to say this. I think once it's done, it will be better for the world in the sense that it will mean that geopolitical stability will be strengthened. I say that because up till fairly recently, I've been one of those people who believed the trading patterns would eventually translate in Europe to a more secure, a more stable geopolitical environment. That as the Russians and the Europeans traded together, that would mean that economic and commercial links would be established, which neither side would want to break, and that this would stabilize geopolitically the situation in Europe. The last couple of weeks have, I'm sorry to say, disillusioned me about this. I have come to the reluctant view following this massive outpouring of anger against Russia that I have seen in Europe especially, an outpouring of anger which, by the way, has exceeded in volume anything that you can see in the United States itself, and that may surprise many people in the United States. I suspect that what has happened is that this trade with Russia and the appearance of so many Russians in places like Knightsbridge, in the Swiss Alps, and the Italian lakes and all the rest, instead of making relations between Western Europe and Russia better, they've instead made them worse. They've made the two, instead of rubbing along well together, have simply aggravated and antagonized each other. Familiarity, far from creating friendships and bridges, seems to have created frictions instead. And I think certainly the Russians have come to that conclusion. A Russian official spoke recently about the need to put aside ideas of friendship between the Russians and the Europeans and to talk about peaceful coexistence instead. Peaceful coexistence was the formula invented during the Cold War by various people within the Soviet Union. It's sometimes attributed to Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the Soviet leader in the 1950s, but in fact it can be traced all the way back to Vladimir Lenin, only he didn't speak of peaceful coexistence, he spoke of peaceful cohabitation. In other words, two blocks which coexist with each other, which have contacts and trade with each other, but at minimal levels, which do not seek integration with each other, but which nonetheless somehow manage to negotiate and manage their differences. I think realistically that was the way forward in the past, and it is the way forward again. I think that illusions have gone, and I think that realities now are what face us. I think we will eventually see the three Eastern Slav republics, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, reintegrate with each other. We will see, as I said in an earlier program, the Eastern Slav superpower that used to exist in the form of the Soviet Union reconstitute itself, but we will see little friendship between that superpower and the nations of the West. We will get peaceful coexistence instead. And if that is the way to secure peace and to achieve stability, well, perhaps that's better than living in the world of illusions, the hope of a friendship that is never achieved, in which we have lived up to now. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. And can I again remind you that you can follow us on Rumble and Locals and on other platforms. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the things that you find there. You can also support this channel by checking your subscription. And please, if you've liked this video, tick the like button. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.